Australia moves to toughen its citizenship requirements and change its visa program. Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull says it's all part of putting Australia first. Hello, I'm Nathan King, filling in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. Hello again. Australia, with its long history of immigration, claims to be the most successful multicultural society in the world. Since 1945, over 7 million immigrants have flowed into Australia from more than 200 countries, and about 27% of its population is foreign-born. But now, in part because of security concerns, it is tightening citizenship requirements. Australia's Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, recently outlined some of the key changes.
The headline points are these. You will need to be a permanent resident for 4 years. So that means longer time in Australia as a permanent resident before you apply to be a citizen. You'll need to have competent English. That is a vital requirement. Not a requirement at the moment, but we all know that the key to successful integration into the Australian community, to economic success, and every success, social success, in becoming part of the community is being able to speak English. So that's a very important change. And also we need to ensure that our citizenship test enables applicants to demonstrate how they have integrated into and engaged with our Australian community.
And the Prime Minister has also announced the abolition of his country's skilled worker visa program. He says he wants to protect Australian jobs. Let's take a listen.
We have, and we always will be, an immigration nation, but we must ensure that the foundation of that success is maintained, and the foundation is that our migration system is seen to work in the national interest. It's seen to deliver for Australians. It's seen to ensure that Australian jobs are filled by Australians wherever possible.
OK, let's get to our panel. And joining us from Sydney is Linda Kirk. She is an expert on migration law and a senior lecturer at Australia National University. Also joining us from Sydney is Adam Creighton. He's a journalist with the Australian. Welcome, all of you, to the show. Adam, your paper's been pretty much across this, actually broke some of the news. And it is big news, isn't it? This is a big shift in Australian policy. Just run down what more details you can provide for us, and how much of a sea change is it for Australia?
Well, look, it is a fairly big change. I mean, in essence, they've reduced the number of skilled occupations from around 650 to around 400. And many of those jobs, such as journalists, for instance, or policy analysts, will no longer be on the list. So effectively, if you're a skilled worker in those areas, you won't be able to come to Australia as readily as you could before. And the change that the Prime Minister flagged earlier, that you have to live in Australia for 4 years now as opposed to 1 before you can become a citizen, that is a very dramatic change. I mean, I know a lot of my friends, in fact, actually were just about to send in their papers. And of course, now they have to stay here for 4 years rather than 1.
And there's this character test as well, Australian values. You know, that's pretty amorphous. Can you put your finger on what that means?
Well, look, I think the reality is that this change is born of the economic anxiety that we're seeing in all rich countries. I don't think this is really about Australian values. I mean, the immigration system that Australia has had for a good 25 years has been very generous. It's been points-based. It's been very popular, I would say. But we've seen in the past 5 years, with sluggish wage growth and relatively high unemployment in Australia and increased anxiety generally, that we're seeing in many countries around the world, and Australia is just one of them, where governments are cracking down, so to speak, on their skilled immigration flows. We're seeing similar moves in Europe, of course, and in the United States. So I don't think Australia is an exception. And but I do think that this was a surprise. I think that this came. I don't think anyone was expecting the immigration rules to change within Australia. But you know, we have to remember too, the government has a very slender majority in the Parliament. So it has an inclination to be populist because it wants to win the next election.
Yeah, I'm going to follow up with you on that. A lot of people domestically have been accusing Malcolm Turnbull of moving to the right as his popularity wanes. He recently said, you know, protectionism is a path to poverty, but we've seen a rise in the One Nation Party, which is more right, some anti-Islamic policies as well. Is that what he's doing?
Well, yes, I think that's right. And we saw essentially that the One Nation Party and also the Labor Party, as far as I understand, the opposition party here, they both supported the changes, basically. You know, there are a few quibbles, but I'd be very surprised if they take issue with them, because they know that, in essence, these are popular changes. That doesn't necessarily mean the changes are right, and I do think that Australia risks ostracising some very talented potential immigrants. And I personally don't think the changes are necessarily good. I think the citizenship changes are effectively a bit of a dog whistle, if you like, tightening the English standards and so forth. And as I said earlier, I think we risk missing out on lots of talented young people from around the world who would like to live here, who would like to get citizenship, but they will change their mind now because they have to live here for more than 4 years first, and they will simply go to Canada or the United States or Britain instead.
Linda, let me bring you in here. What do you make of the changes? What's driving it? And is it domestic politics? Is it the pressures that we've seen that makes it the America First policy or Brexit?
Thanks, Nathan. Unfortunately, I didn't hear what the speaker from the Australian had to say.
Yeah,
but,
we had some communication
my
problems, but
take
go
on
ahead.
it is that, in a sense, that's okay. In a sense, the two changes in a way sort of dovetail together in the sense that many people who come here on 457 visas come here because they then wish to transition to permanent residency and then wish to transition onto citizenship. So the fact that there's going to be these significant changes to the 457 visa, and then the fact that people are now going to have to be permanent residents for 4 years before they can become citizens is really going to slow down that process. So I just heard the tail end of the other speaker, and I agree that this is probably going to deter a number of talented professionals from coming to Australia and perhaps send them in the direction of the United States or Canada or the UK.
Yeah, let's stay with you, Linda, and give you a fair crack. Is this a solution looking for a problem? Because the 457 visa, I think, applies to what, sort of just under 100,000 people in a workforce of what, 12 million. So it's not really going to create a boon for Australian jobs immediately, is it?
Exactly. What you say is absolutely right. There's about 96,000 people who currently are on 457 visas, and that represents less than 1% of the total Australian workforce. So it's actually, even though it sounds like a big number, it's actually quite a small number when you look at the overall workforce. And as you say, it's not as though we're not going to still have a visa which is very similar to the 457 visa. I think it's going to be called the temporary skill shortage visa, and there will be some different requirements to it, some different eligibility criteria and the like, but essentially we're still going to maintain that visa. It's really just a bit of tinkering with some of the requirements. So that is still going to be in existence. So in a sense, you know, maybe it's a little bit of window dressing in the sense it's seen to be a response to concerns about overseas workers taking domestic workers' jobs. And, you know, there are some issues with the 457 visa, I don't deny that, and there is some room for change. But really, I think you do wonder what is actually really going on here, or whether or not it's really just a political attempt to dispel some concerns in the community.
Staying with you, is Australia a bit like other developed countries where when you get immigrant workers, they either work at sort of the bottom of the value chain? The UK is going through this with Brexit. They were even thinking of issuing barista visas so people can get their coffee in the morning. But also at the top of the skills chain in terms of highly skilled workers, which are part of the global marketplace. Is this going to make Australia less competitive and also leave open jobs that many Australians perhaps don't want to do?
Well, it's an interesting point that you make, because looking at the top occupations for the 457 visa currently, and IT professionals are the ones who take most of the 457 visas, I should say, who are issued the 457 visas. So they are sort
like
of
the
in the
H1B
professional
in the
category
US,
rather than the I suppose that would be the equivalent, yeah, rather than, as you say, all due respect to people who are baristas in coffee shops. So it does tend to be rather the highly sort of skilled professional work where visas are going to. But as the other speaker said as well, there is going to be a shake-up of the skilled occupation list. There's currently about 400 occupations on that list. It's going to reduce down to, I think it's about 600 going down to 400, I think. So there's about 1/3 decrease. But many of the skilled occupations that have dropped off are such things as, one that stood out for me is goat farmer. So I think that it's probably the case that there's not a great deal of demand for that. But, you know, there is a shake-up, and I heard your other speakers say that there are some of the more high-profile occupations, such as journalists and the like, that are coming off the list. So there is going to be a shake-up. There's no question about that.
Foreign journalists, get rid of them all. No, I mean, I read goat herder in the tabloids. Antique dealer was another one. But there's a point here, isn't there, Adam? Let's bring you back in. The people who may need to come in most, i.e. refugees, may not be able to get in under this sort of test, right? You have to be computer literate, you have to learn English. I'm just thinking, one example I read in the papers was, you know, perhaps a South Sudanese refugee woman who is fleeing violence and then suddenly has to cross this barrier very, very quickly.
Yes, look, that's a good point. My understanding is that Australia's refugee intake is not going to change as a result of this, but as you point out, it may take much longer for these people ultimately to become citizens. And I'm not entirely sure on whether that process is changing, but certainly I've seen assessments that suggest the English test that will now be required is actually so tough that many local-born Australians wouldn't pass the test. So it'll be interesting to see how that fares. But I mean, in fairness to the government, and just to reiterate what Linda said, I mean the Productivity Commission here in Australia a couple of years ago did recommend fairly sweeping changes to the 457 visa program, because there was a perception and also a reality that it was being wrought. In 2013, we saw something like 100,000 workers come into the country, into the fast food industry, and I think quite reasonably many Australians felt that there weren't really shortages in those areas, and that in some cases it was for businesses to pay very low wages to these foreign workers, and that's being tidied up, but I think that left a real political scar on the program.
Linda, I just want to talk to you about Australian values a little bit more, because there's a lot of people internationally scratching their head saying what makes Australian values unique from perhaps other Western liberal democracies. And also, some people have sort of pointed out perhaps the irony of immigrants having to understand Aboriginal culture when perhaps white European settlers did not do so for so long. I hope I'm putting that politely so that no one gets offended.
Yes. Right. No, I understand what you're saying. I think you're right. I think this issue of trying to test people's values is a very difficult thing, and some may say impossible thing to do. You know, it's one thing to have a knowledge of values, and it's another thing to actually carry them out in your daily life. And that's something that really can't be tested. And I think also there's the issue there too of English language, which is something that Adam just referred to. And he's absolutely right when he says that this could well impact upon refugees and people who do not have a good understanding of the English language, because the test is conducted in English. Plus, furthermore, there is now going to be this additional requirement of a separate English language test. And people are going to have to demonstrate competent English, being 6 on the international English language testing system. And that's going to be very difficult for people to do. But coming back to your question of culture and values and how Australian values are different to those across the Western world, well, I think largely they are very, very similar. I suppose there are some things which are unique to Australia, and the current test, for example, asks things about the Commonwealth flag, the Australian flag rather, about aspects of the parliamentary process and those kinds of things which are unique to Australia. But it seems that the changes that are being introduced are going to go more to values. So it's very difficult to know what is going to be asked, firstly, and also whether or not answering a question, yes or no, or choosing the right item in a multiple choice, really does demonstrate that a person does in fact hold those values. And I think the difficulty too is just how on earth do you identify those values when we're living in such a diverse, multicultural community and society?
Well, as long as they don't have the words fair dinkum on the test, because I think I would fail that. I've never understood exactly what it meant. Adam, let's bring you back in
it
because...
could well be.
Adam, let's bring you back in because obviously some of this is couched in security terms. That we need to have an idea of who's coming in and who they are because of the threat of terrorism. Now, we have seen, obviously, acts of terrorism on Australian soil, but is it as big a threat to change the whole immigration system?
Well, look, my view is that these changes won't actually have any effect on the prospect of terrorism incidents in Australia. I mean, we've seen overseas that most terrorist acts are performed by people who were born in the country in the first place. So
Same here, yeah.
I think to the extent that that works, I mean, the horse has really bolted on that. I mean, I think, you know, we're seeing governments around the world wanting to tighten up immigration. I think it's too late. I think they need to focus on the levels of cohesion in their society as it is. Thankfully, Australia's been very little touched by terrorism so far, and let's hope it stays that way. But certainly, as you suggest, there's a perception in people's mind that terrorists come from overseas, but statistically, that's really not the case.
Linda, in terms of terrorism, do you think that it's the fear of terrorism that makes people support these kind of measures, or the actual acts themselves?
Well, the thing about terrorism is that it creates fear, doesn't it? So the two kind of go hand in hand. But I do agree that all of these changes are happening in this broader context that we're seeing throughout the world. That is concerns about terrorism, concerns about security, and that feeds fear, and it also feeds people's concerns about others, and others being largely people who are coming from other countries. So I think it's a very concerning trend because it makes us suspicious of those who are around us, and when we see these kinds of changes that are happening, even though they may not have, as Adam said, any impact whatsoever on terrorism or the prospect of terrorism, it just feeds into people's minds and makes them think about and be fearful of others. And I don't think that is a very healthy thing to be occurring when we're actually trying to achieve the opposite, that is more cohesion, more community, more acceptance of others.
Well, let's hold it there because we've got Australia first meets America first when Malcolm Turnbull comes to the White House in just a few days. But right now we need to take a quick break. Much more on Australia's immigration issues when we return to The Heat.